when the United States was thrust into World War II, it wasn't with a slow march. It was with a shockwave. A nation that had watched the world burn from afar suddenly found itself staring directly into the flames. Factories roared to life. Young men lined up at recruiting stations. America was awake, and the world would feel it. But before the beaches of Normandy, before the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific, before the world knew names like Bastogne, Anzio, or Okinawa, America's first major ground test came somewhere unexpected. North Africa. A place most Americans couldn't find on a map. A place of scorching heat, endless desert, and a brutal enemy dug into every ridge and ravine. It was here, thousands of miles from home, that American troops would face the German army for the very first time. The stakes were enormous. The Allies needed a foothold. The Axis needed to hold the line. And the U.S. Army, still green, still learning, still proving itself, was about to be thrown into a trial by fire. The moment America stepped onto the world stage with boots on the ground. From the beaches of Morocco to the rugged mountains of Tunisia, American soldiers confronted a seasoned enemy who'd already carved its legend across Europe. They were untested, they were inexperienced, but they were determined. And in the crucible of North Africa, they would transform from recruits into warriors, from a nation preparing for war into a nation fighting one. This is where America's combat story truly begins. This is where the U.S. Army learns, adapts, bleeds, and rises. When America was thrust into World War II, a generation answered the call, stepping from ordinary lives into extraordinary battles. This series follows their footsteps, the grit, the sacrifice, the moments that shaped victory. From the first clashes in North Africa to the final push across Europe and beyond, these are the stories of courage under fire. Welcome to American Combat Chronicles, where history meets the men who made it. In the early months of 1943, the American Army in North Africa was still learning what it meant to fight a modern war. They had courage, they had numbers, but against the veterans of Hitler's Africa Corps, courage alone wasn't enough. In February, at a narrow mountain gap called Kasserine Pass, that hard lesson came in the form of defeat, brutal, humiliating, and unforgettable. The U.S. Second Corps, fresh from the United States and untested in large-scale battle, faced Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, one of Germany's most brilliant commanders. Rommel struck fast, his panzers slicing through the passes like steel through paper. American units, spread thin and poorly coordinated, were overwhelmed. The desert sky turned black with smoke. Communications failed. Tanks burned. Infantrymen fought bravely but without clear orders. Some divisions collapsed under relentless artillery fire. In those few days, the U.S. Army lost nearly 6,000 men and more than 100 tanks. For the Germans, it was another victory. For the Americans, it was a wake-up call, a painful reminder that wars aren't won by courage alone, but by discipline, coordination, and adaptability. After Kasserine, changes came fast. General Dwight Eisenhower replaced the commander of Second Corps, Lloyd Fredendall, with a new leader, General George S. Patton. Patton's arrival was like a thunderclap. He reorganized units, enforced strict discipline, and drilled soldiers relentlessly. Every man had to know his job, his weapon, and his terrain. The army that had stumbled at Kasserine would never be caught unprepared again. Across Tunisia, American and British forces regrouped. The lessons of Kasserine became the blueprint for the coming victories. Use cover, move with purpose, and coordinate artillery, infantry, and armor as one. By April, those same men who once retreated in confusion were ready for their hardest test yet. A steep rocky hill in northern Tunisia that the Germans called Jebel Tahent, and the Americans would remember forever as Hill 609. The Battle of Hill 609, the Fog and the Fury. April 1943, northern Tunisia, the final phase of the North African campaign. The Axis forces, desperate and cornered, had withdrawn into a defensive line known as the Matur Tabourba Line, a chain of rugged hills and valleys designed to hold the Allies at bay. At the center of it stood a single rise, Hill 609, rising nearly 2,000 feet from the dusty plains below. To the German command, Hill 609 was the anchor of their defense. To the Americans, it was an immovable obstacle they had to take or die trying. The task fell to the U.S. 34th Infantry Division, known as the Red Bull Division. These were farm boys, factory workers, and small-town kids from the Midwest who'd been fighting across North Africa since 1942. They'd learned the hard way, against Rommel's veterans at Kasserine Pass, that courage alone wasn't enough. But by April, they were battle-tested, hardened, and determined to prove themselves. The 34th's commander, Major General Charles Ryder, understood the challenge ahead. Hill 609 wasn't just another patch of ground. It overlooked every road, every valley, every approach to the German line. Any movement by day drew immediate, deadly artillery fire from its slopes. The Germans had dug into caves and crevices with machine guns zeroed in on every angle of advance. The first assaults failed. The men who climbed in daylight were cut down by shell fire and snipers before reaching halfway up. For days, the Americans probed the hill's defenses, learning, adapting, finding where the enemy fired from, and where the ground might offer cover. By the night of April 28th, Ryder and his officers had devised a new plan, one born not from brute force, but from terrain and timing. They would attack under cover of fog at dawn, using the mist to blind the German gunners. It was a gamble, but one rooted in experience. As the sun began to rise, thick fog clung to the hills like a shroud. The air was cold, wet, and silent, the kind of silence that amplifies every heartbeat. The men of the 135th Infantry Regiment began to move. They advanced slowly, step by step, their boots scraping rock, their rifles slick with dew. They could hear distant movement, German voices, but the fog made friend and foe nearly invisible. Through the gray haze, Captain John Benson of Company F remembered later it felt like walking into the clouds of hell. You couldn't see 20 feet, but you knew death was out there waiting. But for the first time, the Americans were unseen. German observers, blind and confused, fired wildly into the mist. Their shells whistled overhead, exploding harmlessly behind the advancing lines. Taking advantage of the confusion, American squads moved up narrow gullies and rocky draws, using every curve of the land as cover. Machine gunners laid down suppressive fire where they guessed the enemy emplacements were, while riflemen and engineers advanced closer with grenades and mortars. By mid-morning, the fog began to lift. The Germans saw their mistake too late. The 135th Infantry had climbed far higher than they expected, nearly halfway up the hill, within striking distance of the enemy's outer defenses. The fight now turned brutal and personal. German artillery roared from the summit, tearing up the slopes with relentless precision. But the Americans were dug in, shallow foxholes, stone walls, anything to survive the shelling. For every barrage that fell, another squad crawled closer. The ground was soaked with sweat and dirt. the air filled with metal and echoes. The hill became a maze of hand-to-hand skirmishes, grenades, bayonets, and sheer willpower. One platoon leader later said, "It wasn't war up there. It was survival, rock by rock." By afternoon, the Americans had reached the final ridge line. German paratroopers, elite and desperate, counterattacked again and again. But the Red Bulls refused to break. Coordinating artillery support from the valley below, U.S. gunners adjusted their fire with deadly accuracy, shells falling just ahead of the advancing infantry, pushing the Germans back meter by meter. Then, as dusk approached, the final assault came. Company F and G charged the last positions, bayonets fixed, shouting, their silhouettes backlit by the setting sun and the smoke of battle. The Germans fired one last salvo before withdrawing under cover of darkness. At dawn on April 29th, Hill 609 belonged to the Americans. The flag of the 34th Infantry was raised on its battered peak. Below them, the valleys that had once been death traps were silent. The German artillery was gone. The line, the so-called impregnable anchor of Axis defense, had been broken. The victory came at a cost. Hundreds were wounded or killed. But their sacrifice had opened the road to Bizerte and Tunis, and within weeks, the North African campaign was over. What made the difference that day wasn't just bravery, it was adaptation. The Americans had learned from defeat, from Kasserine's chaos, and from every failed push before. They used the terrain, the weather, and the fog itself as allies. In the official records, Hill 609 is described as a minor engagement. But for those who fought there, it was the moment when the American army came of age, when raw recruits became soldiers, and when the tide of the war began to shift westward toward Europe. Major General Ryder called it the toughest fight we ever had. But to the men who survived, it was more than that. It was proof that courage and cleverness, even against superior artillery, could win the day. And so the fog that morning wasn't just weather. It was a turning point, a veil between the old army and the new. Hill 609 became a symbol of grit, ingenuity, and sacrifice. The high ground that showed the world what the U.S. Army had become. They climbed that hill for each other, for the men beside them, for the ones who didn't make it back down, and for the victory that would soon cross the sea to Europe. This is the story of Hill 609, where fog, courage, and the will to adapt turned the tide of a war. The Battle of Hill 609 wasn't just a clash of forces. It was a test of grit, strategy, and sacrifice. Through the fog and the fury, American soldiers carved their legacy into the hills of Tunisia, one hard-fought inch at a time. If this story moved you, taught you something new, or made you feel the weight of history, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to honor their courage. Comment below with your thoughts or questions, and subscribe to American Combat Chronicles for more powerful stories from the front lines of U.S. military history. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and keep the legacy alive.